Welcome to the True False podcast. I'm Allison Coffelt. In this episode, we're turning inward for a fest behind-the-scenes conversation. I sat down with Chelsea Myers of Tiny Attic Productions to talk about the bumpers she created for True False 2019. They centered on our visual theme of the fest this year, which was Stranger Host. Chelsea Myers, welcome to the True False podcast.
It's good to be here.
So you grew up in Columbia. We went to high school together.
We did.
And I'm really excited to talk today about your bumpers. First of all, let's just talk about what bumpers are, because it's kind of an insider lingo thing. They're the little videos at the top of the film that you show, or the film that True False shows. And kind of like, what's the purpose of having a bumper anyway?
So if we're talking industry terms, it's kind of branding for the festival, but it's a lot more than that. It's also kind of I consider them a mental reset button, because the program team puts together such an amazing selection of films, but it can be a lot to go, between 4 to 5 films a day on very intense subjects.
Some people see like 7 or 6. I don't know.
So crazy.
Yeah, it's wild. Good for them.
I know.
So there's a chance for the reset.
So we always try to create a feeling, almost like a calm moment, a peaceful moment before just delivering so much information and emotion and incredibly intricate stories in these feature films or the shorts programs. So the bumpers are that way to just kind of establish the theme of the festival, which is also something that is highly thought through and curated on the art side of True False. And also just, to give you a little tiny break before you dive back in to another amazing story.
Yeah, it's kind of like, I like that idea that it's this a little bit of a grounding, centering, like, okay, you made it, you're here. I want to talk more about the theme. That's going to be the focus of our conversation today. But I also think, I realized when you were talking, the neat thing about the bumpers, and, maybe this happens at other festivals too, is that there's sequence. And so to me, they're also sort of like this unfolding series that happens across 4 days. So each day is a variation on the theme.
Yeah, that's a really big deal because, like you mentioned, some people will see 7 films in a day. So we wanted to make sure that we have a different, unique story each day. So there's 4 bumpers total in the sequence, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. And they get deeper into the theme, but also just explain different sides of the theme, because there's so many different variations of Stranger Host, as we'll get into this relationship dynamic.
We're going to focus, I think, today on the Thursday bumper, which is E. coli, but we're going to touch on all of the bumpers. But the festival theme this year was this idea of Stranger Host with the arrow in the middle that kind of points in both directions. So stranger, arrow pointing back at stranger, arrow pointing at the word host. Let's go ahead and listen to the theme for Thursday, which is it called E. coli?
Yeah.
Every living thing we see with our naked eye takes up only a tiny tuft on the tangled tree of life. The earth belonged once entirely to E. coli and their ilk. Identified by a German at the dawn of germ theory, a commensal little rod-shaped thing thriving on the stuff in us. They lead a quiet life, but born by our industrial food supply, a strange new network that shunts them into lettuce or a fast food hamburger, some strains enter into a deadly program. Sitting on its pedestal of intestinal cells shooting molecules in until the cells rip open, E. coli 0157H7 feeds, but our suffering is accidental. Its hosts aren't that important to why E. coli is the way it is. But without bacteria, life on Earth would be done forever.
So let's talk about just the basic structure of how each of these pieces for the 4 days of the fest were constructed. So each bumper has a different relationship that it focuses on.
So really interesting fact. That's terrifying if you look at it the wrong way, but I think it's actually really cool. Parasites outnumber free-living organisms 4 to 1.
Wow.
Yeah, we all got parasites, or, depending on how you look at it, we could be considered a parasite.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's a billion types of these different relationships, varying from mutualistic to parasitic. Mutualistic being something that gives each species involved in the relationship a benefit, and parasitic, obviously, one species gets the benefits and another one is harmed in the process. And then commensalistic is the in between on that. And
Where commensalistic, so they're both getting something, but they're both being a little bit harmed.
it's more neutral territory.
Okay. So mutualistic is like they're both being benefited. They're both getting, better in their own way. Parasitic, one is maybe suffering a little more, and then
Commensalistic is just like you've got a
chill.
hitchhiker that's not talking to you and not bothering you in any way. It's just along for the ride.
Nice. Okay, so you have these 3 different kinds of relationships, and each of the bumper episodes was, so you conceived of these, there's 3 relationships, and that was sort of the fodder for then going to the plant and animal kingdom to find examples of these 3 relationships. And then each bumper episode is a poet who's speaking with a scientist who is an expert in whatever particular relationship you've decided to highlight in that day's bumper, right?
So what happened was once Paul Sturtz told me the theme was stranger host, I compiled a list of 20 different relationships that I thought were really unique and interesting. There's a lot that we're familiar with, barnacles on whales is, I feel like, a kind of obvious one. Or like the little birds that sit on crocodiles and like pick their teeth or clean them and whatever.
Yeah.
So I was trying to find more unique ones that aren't readily available to the public. And I sent this list of 20 different relationships to these 4 poets that we had nailed down to write the scripts. And they picked the ones that interested them most, and there's no overlap. Something about each one spoke to each individual poet. So
Yeah, and we should say in the clip we just heard, that's Takia Thomas reading the poetry of Jaswinder Bolina, and the scientist, and we'll hear from him in a minute, but the scientist that Jaswinder spoke with for the E. coli bumper was Carl Zimmer.
Who you've probably heard on Radiolab or read his articles in the New York Times or read, one of his over a dozen books. He's amazing, and I just so happened to, on a whim, reach out to him after reading his book, Microcosm. And he was in between book tours, and he was like, yeah, sure, I can hop on the phone and talk to a poet about this.
No, that's really cool that he's such an established figure. And in fact, all of the scientists that we talked to were, they might not have the popular reach that Carl Zimmer has, but each of them were really are quite advanced. They're experts in their field.
Yeah, I had to dig really deep for some of them. Like our sea slug, that's our Saturday bumper. It was really hard to find an expert on this one particular nudibranch. It's a type of sea slug that has all these different varying relationships with algae. It's the only example of a nudibranch that is mutualistic, and algae doesn't die when it's consumed. And there's only 2 experts on that in the world, and I found their remote research papers after digging for hours and reached out to them, and they were fortunately available to talk to us as well.
And I love the sea slug bumper. It's my favorite, and I think it's Mark McKee's poem. Is that right?
Nikki Beer,
and then Mark McKee read it. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. We should maybe just listen to that bumper. It's the Saturday at True False bumper. And then we'll listen to it for a sense of how some of these bumpers are sitting together in this series of 4. And then we'll turn our attention again to E. coli.
The sea slug Melibe engeli devours the green body of the algae with gusto, devours even the algae's dreams of being forest, of being its own green continent. Uniting with the infinite branches of the slug's gut, the algae embeds itself into the very cells of the animal, often thriving there for generations. The algae claims the slug's sunlight, turning that warmth into shared sugar, enough to nourish both entirely for many months. And so they drift in this embrace, a new dream together in the ocean's endless sleep. Isn't this the world we hope to recover? Growth without destruction, consumption without cruelty or annihilation. If we dive deep enough, will it come back to us?
So this one probably touched you so much because I think about it as a love story. It's like the perfect Disney princess happy ending love story.
Well, I think I love it because I love the question it poses at the end. The question of recovery and is it still there? What can be salvaged? Those feel like the essential questions for our time, if I can be so grandiose. I think that's why I really love it. And I love the blue. It's a very blue bumper. It's
It is.
all blue. So let's talk. So visually, we're listening to these on the radio and they're really sound rich. But also, if you watch these on the True Falls Vimeo page or our other social media accounts, there's so much happening with animating, with the animation. You're an animator, you're a filmmaker. How did you start to think about getting these relationships that were so microscopic into an animated form that would then be projected onto this enormous screen across our venues at the fest?
Oh man, there's a lot to cover on this one. Well, first off, I kind of started with a visual theme, a synergetic color scheme. We knew that we were really inspired by Joan Muro in the beginning with Dave Reigel's poster design. A lot of the crazy color combinations that artists explored in the 1960s. Josef Albers is another one that really influenced me.
We should mention that the theme for the fest doesn't influence the film programming, but it does influence the bumpers, the art installations, and a number of other solicited artwork throughout the festival. And that's why we have the artistic theme, but it's separate from the programming. But sorry, go ahead.
So I started with a color scheme, and also the reason I should say really quick, the reason we picked poets to work with is because I immediately thought about the educational videos a lot of us 80s and 90s kids saw growing up in public school. The almost lyrical nature of how narrators deliver all of this information to you. So I was like, let's get poets on board with this to get, a little richer with the language. So we started with these scripts and a color scheme, and then from there, I don't even know how many dozens of hours I spent researching each of these. And E. coli had a wealth of written material about it for sure, but finding visuals and finding video content on it was a little bit more difficult for our specific purposes in its interaction with the host, which is where, reading Carl Zimmer's Microcosm was so important because he's so vivid with his language.
Yeah, and he writes and he speaks about it, and this is what I think is so cool about, experts who spend so much of their time doing these things and then have people who have that level of expertise, but then also have the ability to explain it to people who really are walking in with very little or no understanding. I think to me that's one of the things that I love most about this bumper project is sort of the democratization of some of this information, which is maybe a little bit what documentary does too. So we have a clip of Jaswinder Bolina, who's the poet who wrote the script for the E. coli episode, on his call for research with science writer Carl Zimmer.
It's interesting that, the researchers have tried to go back and say, well, how long has E. coli 0157H7 been causing these outbreaks? It doesn't seem like it's been doing it that much until recently. I mean, it's been around, maybe for centuries. But in terms of being the cause of outbreaks, when you go back and you look at when scientists look at samples taken from sick people, it doesn't seem to be a big factor. So it really does seem to just be fostered by our industrial food system because it seems to live very comfortably in cattle. So in the gut of a cow, it's, it doesn't cause much trouble at all. Unfortunately, there are lots of ways now for bacteria that live in the gut of a cow to come into contact with people. Unfortunately, when it gets into us and it tries to sort of do its thing, it wreaks havoc. It instead of being, a commensal microbe inside a cow, it becomes a parasite, a pathogen, and it causes a lot of trouble.
So what he's talking about specifically there is E. coli 0157H7, which was the harmful example that we used of E. coli. In the bumper, we speak about how it's harmless and living a quiet life inside of us. There are a ton of strains of E. coli that are just completely harmless, commensal, as Carl says. Like K12 is one of them. They can actually even give us benefits like helping us develop our immune system and aiding in development and growth, processing vitamins, etc.
Really?
But when we don't process food correctly in this huge industrial food system, it can become very harmful and cause a lot of damage, sometimes being fatal in really young people and really old people.
Yeah, I mean, I can't help but think about, I mean, so much of what we do at True False when we choose the artistic theme is really try to think of so many resonances that are happening either culturally or within even the sort of specifics of the documentary world. And I think when I was hearing you talk about, I was thinking about how there's just such metaphor for the ways in which there's this huge complex thing, which is E. coli. It has a bunch of different kinds of strands. It does a bunch of different things. We know one, generally. We know
Yeah, we see it in the media as being
as
harmful and
H,
scary.
what was it? What, H1, sorry.
0157H7.
Yeah, I'm getting confused with bird flu. Yes, we know of that one strand, and so that's the story we latch onto. Or like for me, I'll just speak for me. That's the story I latch onto. Like of like, oh my gosh, E. coli, gross. And I don't always think about like all of the other components of it, or that it could be way more I mean, I just don't think about how it is probably far more complex than what I'm just often the snippets that I often hear.
And I do think, speaking to that, I mean, as an animator, when you dive into something, there's a relationship you develop as a creator with your subject, with your character. And E. coli became this very complex character for me, in which, of course, we want to acknowledge the ways in which people typically think about it, but to do it in not a disgusting and horrifying way.
Mm-hmm.
So in the bumper, the visuals for the specific part where we talk about that, I ended up using a bunch of kaleidoscopic effects, which
Yes.
in a way were inspired by Ernst Haeckel, if you're familiar with his art. He's just an incredible biologist, zoologist, and illustrator from the early 1900s, late 1800s. So
Sorry, go ahead. I'm just getting all excited about the kaleidoscope. Go ahead. Yeah.
I just drew a lot of influence from his work in symmetry and composition.
What was it about the kaleidoscope that appealed to you? What was going on there?
Honestly, partially, I kind of dreamed the vision for these bumpers at the very beginning as something that if I lived in the 1960s or 70s, I would stumble across in like a giant warehouse party, like just projected on the wall. But I knew I wanted something that was peaceful and that had good flow, transitional flow. So that was the method I used in order to, create more of a relaxing vibe, and less straight up motion graphics vibe that we see with a lot of instructional or informational animations these days.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that happens is in the bumpers is that there's the type of animation is more like you're seeing a drawing and then you see layers and images and types of colors and use overlay a lot, whereas some types of animation like show the ant, or show something just like in motion.
Yeah,
like,
this overlay concept, it was about the layers and the merging of the host and the stranger. So I used a lot of compositing in the animation to bring us back and forth between our larger scale and smaller scale characters. But I should mention, I was really lucky to work with the super talented Becca Solinger on the artwork. We created, I don't know how many hundreds of drawings it ended up being in order to make a combination of hand-drawn sequences, like what you're familiar with typical 2D animation, although we're using sometimes just like 10 to 12 drawings per frame or per second, and then more of just like creating these landscapes that we navigate through if a camera is moving through this imaginary world.
Thank you so much for being here. I want to come back in a moment and talk more about some of the influences that helped shape the bumpers. And I also want to hear a little bit more about the music that is behind the bumpers. I'm sitting here, you showed me before we were getting started this really amazing drawing in a notebook that you were using in the field, I think, of an ant. So really, this whole thing in some ways started with an ant for you.
Yeah.
How perfect, the ant in the sandstorm.
So I was in Kenya after filming a documentary in Uganda, and walking through Laikipia with this extraordinary Maasai guide. And I was really concerned, and I pointed at this acacia tree, and I was like, is this tree diseased? And he was like, no, no, no. The galls, the swollen thorns, are a natural thing the tree does in order to house these ants that end up being bodyguards for the tree. And I was just like, whoa, halt. What? He's like, yeah, basically the tree tells the ants when a large herbivore like a giraffe or an elephant is eating too many leaves, and the ants attack the giraffe or elephant.
And so the ant is like the guardian of making sure the tree keeps enough leaves to go on.
Mm-hmm. And I was really confused by this because I was like, wait, how? So I recorded a drawing of the ant, and when I finally got internet service, looked it up, and it's this specific cocktail ant that we talk about in the Friday bumper. I was really happy one of the poets was as inspired about the story as I was, because it's actually a very complex relationship between the tree and the ant. They're extremely helpful to each other. The tree provides...
So mutualistic.
Yeah, mutualistic for the most part, but not always.
Okay.
The tree gives the ant shelter in the galls, but also food through secreting nectar. And then the ant is the bodyguard army for the tree. But if there's no giraffes or elephants around attacking the tree, then they turn on each other. So it's like they have to have this element of drama in their relationship in order for it to work. Todd Palmer was our scientist advising on that, and he's done, I think, 10 years of research on this very specific relationship and the complexities of it.
I'd love to take a listen to this Friday bumper, which features the cocktail ant and the acacia tree.
Cocktail ants burrow, then hollow, then gall the thorns, making a flute of the wind. Other trees die of such invasion, but the whistling thorn acacia secretes a nectar to feed these guests. Sometimes a giraffe comes. The tree mimics ant pheromones, and ants respond in a biting and stinging frenzy. You could say the tree learned to speak ant, and the ants learned to answer. So much depends on the large herbivores. In the absence of such dangerous hunger, branches ask, "What's in it for me?" Desperate, the ants lament in a tongue of unrestrained plundering. How do you live without the sweet grunting melody of a beast learning to speak wind?
The poetry there is by Catherine Nuremberger, and a former Colombian. And the voice recording is by Takia Thomas. This one is one of the bumpers for me that the more I've watched it, the more I get out of it. And some of the things have kind of snuck up on me, like the question, some of the questions that Catherine writes. How do you live without a beast learning to speak wind? But the music here is different to me than some of the other bumpers. Can you talk a little bit about what it was like to collaborate on the music for this project?
So Mike Marshall, who writes music under the name Mike Danger, wrote all of the music and also did the soundscaping for this. He used Pro Tools to create this elaborate, layered sensory experience of sound effects and tones. And yeah, so we started with the scripts and then developed storyboards. And then while I was animating, Mike started to compose these palettes, basically, to describe the emotion, but also the landscape, because each one of these does have a very different landscape. We have an ocean in one, we have an African savanna in another, and our guts for one.
Yeah.
So he created these very complex palettes to help scene set, but then also enhance the emotional turmoil or joy or whatever is going on in each script.
It's a complex project. 4 short films, 4 poets, 4 experts. After mining, through hundreds.
Yeah, there were a lot of collaborators on this project for sure. And the Instant Acacia bumper, I should say, definitely had the most unique hand-drawn frames, which was something I felt really strongly about. Being a kid that grew up loving The Lion King, I wanted to kind of give more of a nod to traditional 2D animation in this specific bumper, especially since we're all so familiar with the African landscape, thanks to the amazing animators at Disney.
Yeah, there's certain things that once they become part of the pop culture fabric, how you work with them after that is you're always in conversation with the images people are carrying.
I mentioned Ernst Haeckel earlier as a big influence with art direction. He did have training and background in zoology and was a big fan of Charles Darwin and actually met him at one point in his life. He developed this really beautiful phylogenetic tree, the tree of life, that has since been rewritten many times over and added to. And I ended up putting a tree of life in the beginning of the E. coli piece because Joss Winder was really inspired by the element that, bacteria in many ways is this ancient being.
Yeah, he talks about that in the interview with Carl Zimmer.
The theme of the film festival makes me wonder at times who is the stranger and who the host. Do we live among bacteria or do bacteria live among us? You know what I mean? Like this sort of, they predate us, they've been here longer. They populate our guts, they live on our skin, they live in our mucous membranes, they live in the environment. They were here first, they will conceivably be here long after. And so are we borrowing their real estate or are they borrowing ours?
So that was science writer Carl Zimmer speaking with Joss Winder Bellina. And that was a big influence for this tree image early on?
Yeah, okay. So one specific thing that I tried to do with this unique bumper, the E. coli bumper, was show zoom and scale on how this extremely tiny microorganism inside of us has been a dominant force in evolution. And I mean, that's something Carl Zimmer writes a lot about in his book Microcosm, if you're interested more on the subject. But if you look at the bumpers compared to each other, each one of them kind of implements different techniques with animation. And this one I was very interested in showing this zoom sensation of going deep inside of us and then pulling back out to the bigger picture. So there's one scene in which we're looking at E. coli consuming nutrients inside of our intestines, and it starts with the microvilli and then the villi and zooms out to show the intestine as a whole, to give you a sense of how crazy it is that this thing that we can't see with our naked eye affects so much of our life and life as we know it on this planet.
Yeah. And I think animation is such a neat form for that. I mean, it certainly feels so well suited to do that zoom in and zoom out.
It was really interesting to create these imaginary worlds for each of our characters, but at the same time, while trying to get at this magical nature of this environment, these unique environments, not trying to totally mystify the audience or mislead them in any way. So research was a very valuable part of trying to make sure they were as accurate and factual as possible. Also, we're working with 50 seconds, 50 seconds to explain these extremely complex relationships. So I tried to mirror a lot of the visuals with the audio, but also give it added depth to give you a little bit more of a sense of these critters and microorganisms environment.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your research with us today and helping us kind of pull back the curtain on these really beautiful short films you created for True False.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's really fun. That's it for this week's episode. Thanks to Janet Saidi, Mark Johnson, and Betsy Smith for producing this episode. This wraps up the third season of the True False podcast. Special thanks to Ryan Famuliner and Sebastian Martinez Valdivia. Our music was created by Tim Pilcher using sounds from the True False Film Fest. I'm Allison Coffelt. Thanks for listening.